The Dardanelles Strait is a knife of water cutting between Europe and Asia, 40 kilometers long and barely more than a kilometer wide at its narrowest point. It connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and beyond that to the Black Sea and the soft underbelly of the Russian Empire. Control of this waterway meant control of supply routes to Russia, meant the ability to strike at Constantinople itself, meant the possibility of knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the Great War and shifting the entire strategic balance of the conflict. This was the logic that drove the British War Council in early 1915, the logic that sent hundreds of thousands of men to die on a peninsula that most of them had never heard of before they received their orders. The Gallipoli Peninsula rises from the Aegean like a broken finger pointing northwest, its western coast a series of steep cliffs and narrow beaches, its interior a maze of ravines and ridges covered in scrub brush and wildflowers that bloom even in wartime. The Ottoman Turks had fortified it extensively. Artillery batteries on the high ground, machine gun nests covering the approaches, trenches dug into the hillsides with interlocking fields of fire. They knew the British were coming. They had been preparing for months. The plan, conceived by First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill and championed by Admiral Sir Ian Hamilton, was elegant in theory. Land forces at multiple points along the peninsula, secure the high ground, neutralize the Ottoman artillery, and allow the Royal Navy to force the straits and bombard Constantinople into submission. In practice, the plan depended on surprise, on overwhelming firepower, and on the assumption that the Ottoman defenders would break quickly when faced with the professional armies of the British Empire and its dominions. The first waves landed at dawn on April 25th. At Cape Helles, British troops from the 29th Division came ashore on 5 beaches designated by letters S, V, W, X, and Y. At Anzac Cove, 15 kilometers to the north, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps made their landing, expecting to find a gently sloping beach that would allow them to advance inland rapidly. Instead, they found themselves at the base of steep cliffs with Ottoman machine guns already firing down on them from positions that should not have been occupied yet, positions the intelligence summaries had assured them would be lightly defended. The water temperature in the Aegean in April hovers around 62 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to sap strength from men weighed down with 60-pound packs, rifles, ammunition, and entrenching tools. The boats carrying the assault troops were rowed by sailors from the Royal Navy, men who could hear the bullets hitting the water before they could see the shore, who kept rowing because that was their duty, even as the soldiers in the boats began to take casualties before they ever touched sand. At V Beach, the assault troops were loaded onto a converted collier ship, the River Clyde, which was run aground deliberately to serve as a landing platform. As the men poured out through doors cut into the hull, Ottoman machine guns opened fire at point-blank range, turning the water red within seconds. But it was not the machine guns that would haunt the survivors. It was something else, something that began on the second day of the landing, after the initial assaults had been repulsed and the Allied forces had established precarious footholds on the beaches, huddling in shallow trenches scraped into the sand, while Ottoman artillery walked shells up and down the shoreline with methodical precision. The men began to hear music. Not the music of military bands or the songs soldiers sang to keep their spirits up, but something older, something that seemed to come from the water itself. It was a melody without source, rising and falling like waves played on instruments no one could identify. Some described it as strings, like a violin, but deeper, more resonant. Others said it was voices, women's voices, singing in a language that was neither Turkish nor Greek nor any language spoken by the living. The music came at night, during the brief periods when the artillery fell silent and men tried to sleep in the trenches with their feet in water and their rifles cradled against their chests. At first, the officers dismissed it as auditory hallucination brought on by shell shock and exhaustion. The men had been under constant bombardment for 48 hours, had watched their friends die in ways that defied description, had been denied sleep and food and any sense of safety. It was natural, the officers said, for the mind to play tricks under such conditions. But the reports persisted, and they came from men who showed no other signs of psychological breakdown, men who were still functional, still following orders, still fighting effectively. And then the guns began to malfunction. Artillery pieces that had been firing reliably since the landing suddenly jammed or misfired. Rifle bolts stuck closed. Machine guns seized up despite being meticulously cleaned and maintained. The armorers checked everything: ammunition, firing pins, recoil springs, and found no mechanical explanation. The weapons would work for a time, then fail again, always during the periods when the music was loudest, always during the night when the moon was hidden behind clouds and the darkness over the Dardanelles was absolute. The local Greeks, the few who remained in the villages along the peninsula, knew what was happening. They had known it would happen. They called them Siren, the Sirens, spirits of the sea who had lived in these waters since before the age of Homer, since before the Greeks themselves had settled these shores. The ancients had written about them, had described them as creatures who lured sailors to their deaths with irresistible song, who took vengeance on those who disturbed the boundary between land and sea, between the living and the dead. The straits were sacred to them, the Greeks said, and the bodies piling up on the beaches, the blood pouring into the water, the metal and fire and explosives detonating where there should have been only waves and wind. All of this was an offense, a desecration, and the Sirens had awakened to exact their price. The British and Australians did not believe in sirens. They believed in the king, in the empire, in the superiority of British arms, and the righteousness of their cause. They believed that courage and discipline and superior training would prevail over any enemy, human or otherwise. But as the days turned into weeks and the casualties mounted and the music continued to rise from the water every night, some of them began to wonder if there were forces at work on the Gallipoli Peninsula that had nothing to do with bullets or shells, forces that belonged to the land and sea themselves, forces that recognized no flags and honored no treaties. On the night of April 27, 72 hours after the initial landing, a company of the Royal Munster Fusiliers was dug in on a ridge above V Beach when every weapon they carried simultaneously ceased functioning. Rifles, pistols, even bayonets seemed to resist being drawn from their scabbards. And from the water below, from the darkness where the wrecked landing craft still floated with their cargo of dead, came the sound of singing, so beautiful and so terrible that grown men wept without understanding why. The Ottoman artillery, positioned on the hills overlooking the beach, opened fire, but their shells fell short, detonating in the water or impacting the cliff face as if something was deflecting them, as if the Sirens were choosing which side would die that night. By the 3rd of May, the Allied position on Gallipoli had calcified into the kind of stalemate that would define the entire war. The beaches had been secured, but at catastrophic cost, 12,000 casualties in the first week alone. The high ground remained in Ottoman hands. Every attempt to advance inland was met with converging machine gun fire and artillery barrages that turned the narrow ravines into killing grounds. The campaign that was supposed to last weeks had already begun to look like it would last months, possibly years. At Anzac Cove, the Australians and New Zealanders clung to positions that measured barely a kilometer deep from shoreline to furthest forward trench. They called it Anzac, and it became a nation unto itself, a cramped labyrinth of dugouts and saps and communication trenches carved into terrain so steep that supplies had to be hauled up on ropes and the wounded evacuated on stretchers that required 6 men to carry down slopes where one misstep meant a 100-foot fall. The men lived in holes scraped into the hillside, sheltered by canvas or corrugated iron when they were lucky, exposed to the elements when they were not. They cooked over small fires during daylight, extinguishing them before dark because even the smallest light drew sniper fire. They drank water that tasted of petrol because it was transported in old fuel cans, and they ate bully beef and hardtack biscuits that had been baked in England and shipped halfway around the world. The heat during the day was brutal, temperatures climbing above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, baking the men in their wool uniforms until sweat soaked through every layer, and dehydration became as dangerous as enemy fire. At night, the temperature dropped into the 50s, and men who had been sweating hours earlier now shivered in their trenches, trying to sleep while the cold crept through their uniforms and into their bones. But the cold was not natural, the veterans began to notice. It came from specific directions, from the sea always, and it was accompanied by the music that no one could explain. Lieutenant Colonel William Malone, commanding the Wellington Battalion of the New Zealand Infantry, was a meticulous officer who kept detailed records of everything that occurred within his command. On May 4th, he noted in his diary that 17 rifles had malfunctioned during a planned raid, all of them failing at the same moment, precisely when his men were about to go over the top. The raid had to be canceled. The next night, 12 rifles failed. The night after that, 23. Malone sent a report to brigade headquarters requesting inspection by armorer specialists, but before any inspectors arrived, one of his sergeants, a Maori soldier named Wiremu Tewera, approached him with an explanation that Malone initially dismissed as superstition. Tewera said the weapons were being cursed. He said the land and the sea were angry, that they had been violated by the killing, and that the spirits who lived in these waters were taking revenge. He said his people, the Maori, had similar beliefs about certain places in New Zealand, places where many had died, where the tapu, the sacred prohibition, had been broken. In such places, weapons failed, fires would not light, and men who ignored the warnings died in ways that seemed like accidents, but were not. He said the music that came from the water at night was a warning, that it was the spirits announcing their presence, and that if the Anzacs did not acknowledge them, did not show respect, then more weapons would fail and more men would die. Malone was a Presbyterian, a rational man who believed in God and king and country, but not in native spirits or curses. Yet he was also a practical man, and the evidence before him was undeniable. Weapons that should work did not work, and the pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. He asked Tewera what needed to be done, and the sergeant said that in Maori tradition, when entering territory controlled by spirits, one had to perform a karakia, a ritual acknowledgement, and make an offering. Malone asked what kind of offering, and Tewera said that among his people, it would be food or weapons, something of value, cast into the water where the spirits dwelled. Malone did not authorize any such ritual officially, but he did not stop Tewera from conducting one privately. On the night of May 5th, the Maori soldiers in the Wellington Battalion gathered at the edge of the beach, below the trenches where the officers could not see them, and Tewera spoke words in Te Reo Maori, asking permission from the spirits of the place, acknowledging their mana, their power, and offering a portion of their rations cast into the waves. The other soldiers watched, some skeptical, some curious, some frightened by the strangeness of it all. That night the music changed. It became softer, less insistent, and the rifle failures in the Wellington Battalion section ceased entirely. Other units continued to report malfunctions, but Malone's men experienced none. Word spread quickly through the Anzac lines. The Maoris had done something, had performed some kind of native magic, and it had worked. Some of the Australian and New Zealand soldiers began making their own offerings, tossing biscuits or cigarettes into the water, whispering prayers to gods they did not believe in but were willing to hedge their bets on. It was not official. It was not sanctioned. But it happened, quietly, in the spaces between orders and doctrine. At Cape Helles, where the British forces were dug in, the situation was different. The British soldiers came from a culture that had spent centuries dismissing local beliefs as primitive ignorance, and they approached Gallipoli with the same assumptions. When weapons failed, The armorer blamed bad ammunition. When men reported hearing music, the medical officers diagnosed shell shock. There was no room in British military thinking for explanations that involved spirits or curses, and officers who suggested otherwise risked their careers and reputations. But on May 7th, something happened that could not be explained away. A battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers was positioned in trenches overlooking W Beach when their entire stock of ammunition detonated simultaneously. Not from enemy fire, not from sabotage, but spontaneously, as if every round had decided at the same moment to ignite. The explosion killed 43 men and wounded over 100. The blast was so powerful that it collapsed sections of trench and could be heard across the entire peninsula. Investigators found no accelerant, no external ignition source, no mechanical failure that could account for the simultaneous detonation of thousands of rounds of small arms ammunition stored in separate locations across a 50-meter span of trench. The only commonality was that all of the storage points were below ground level, dug into the earth near the water, in positions where the music had been reported as loudest the previous night. A Greek civilian, employed as a translator, told the investigating officers that the area had been a sacred site in ancient times, that offerings had been made there to Poseidon and to the Sirens who guarded the straits, and that disturbing the ground without acknowledgement was forbidden. The officers thanked him for his input and filed a report attributing the explosion to spontaneous combustion of ammunition due to extreme heat and humidity. On May 9th, Major General Sir Alexander Godley, commanding the New Zealand and Australian Division, received a memorandum from one of his intelligence officers, Captain Thomas Reed, that would never appear in any official history. Reed had been interviewing local Greeks who had remained on the peninsula, trying to gather information about Ottoman positions and troop movements, and he had compiled a list of locations that the Greeks insisted should be avoided. These were places, they said, where the Sirens were strongest, where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits was thinnest. Reed had cross-referenced these locations with reports of weapon malfunctions, unexplained casualties, and other anomalies, and the correlation was striking. Every location the Greeks had identified as dangerous corresponded to a position where Allied forces had experienced unusual difficulties. Reed recommended that these locations be avoided when possible, that ammunition and supply dumps be relocated away from the shore and from ravines that led directly to the water, and that local Greek priests be consulted before any major operations to ensure that spiritual protocols were observed. He couched his recommendations in terms of maintaining good relations with the civilian population, of respecting local customs to avoid antagonizing potential allies. But the subtext was clear. Something on Gallipoli was killing Allied soldiers, and it was not solely the Ottoman Empire. Godley read the memorandum, signed it, and forwarded it to Hamilton's headquarters with a brief notation. For your information, local superstitions may be exploited for morale purposes. The recommendations were not implemented. The locations identified by the Greeks continued to be used for military purposes, and the weapon failures continued, spreading now to include not just rifles and machine guns, but artillery pieces, signal equipment, and even the ship-mounted guns of the Royal Navy that were supposed to provide fire support from offshore. On the night of May 11th, HMS Triumph, a pre-dreadnought battleship providing naval gunfire support for the Allied positions, experienced a complete electrical failure while steaming through the Dardanelles. All lights went out simultaneously, the wireless went dead, and the main batteries refused to fire despite multiple attempts by the gun crews. The ship drifted for 40 minutes, completely dark, completely silent, while the officers on the bridge tried to understand what was happening. The crew reported hearing singing, distant but clear, coming from the water around the ship. When power was restored, as suddenly as it had failed, the singing stopped. The captain filed a report attributing the failure to electrical fault of unknown origin under investigation. But in a personal letter to his wife, a letter that would be found among his effects after his death. Later in the war, he wrote, "Something in these waters does not want us here. The men are frightened, and I confess that I am not entirely certain they are wrong to be." The Ottoman forces, watching from the high ground, noticed the patterns too. Their own weapons functioned normally. Their ammunition did not spontaneously detonate. And during the nights when the Allied positions fell silent, except for the music that rose from the water, the Ottomans did not attack, because they knew, as their Greek ancestors had known, that there were forces in the straits older than Islam, older than Christianity, older than any empire, and those forces did not choose sides. They simply demanded respect, and those who did not give it would pay the price. By mid-May, the campaign had settled into a rhythm of attrition that favored neither side. The Allies controlled the beaches and a network of trenches that climbed the slopes but never quite reached the high ground. The Ottomans controlled the ridges and the supply routes from the interior. Both sides launched attacks that gained meters at the cost of hundreds of lives, then lost those same meters in counterattacks that cost hundreds more. The casualty lists grew longer, the hospitals filled, and the music from the water became as regular as the tides, marking the passage of nights that no one would survive unchanged. The weapon failures had become so common that quartermasters began ordering replacement parts in quantities that made no logistical sense. Firing pins, extractors, recoil springs, components that should last for thousands of rounds were failing after dozens. Armorer reports documented metal fatigue that should not have been possible given the age of the weapons and the amount of use they had seen. Some rifle barrels showed signs of corrosion despite being cleaned daily, as if they had been exposed to salt water even though they had never been submerged. Machine gun barrels developed stress fractures that appeared overnight, rendering the weapons unsafe to fire. The soldiers developed their own theories. Some said it was sabotage, that Ottoman agents were infiltrating the supply lines and tampering with equipment. Others said it was the quality of the ammunition, that the factories back in England were shipping defective rounds to save money. But the soldiers who had been on Gallipoli the longest, who had survived the initial landings and the first waves of attacks, they knew better. They had seen the pattern, they had heard the music, and they had learned that certain areas were more dangerous than others, not because of enemy fire, but because of something else. At Anzac Cove, the beach where the original landing had occurred became a place soldiers avoided when possible. Supplies were moved at night quickly, with men walking in the center of the beach rather than near the water's edge. No one set up camp there. No one lingered. The water at that beach was always cold, even during the day when the sun beat down and the temperature climbed into the 90s. Men who waded into it to wash or to retrieve supplies from landing craft reported a sensation like being watched, like invisible hands touching their legs beneath the surface. Some of them developed hypothermia after exposure times that should not have been sufficient to cause it. Private Jack Simpson, an Australian stretcher bearer who had become famous for using a donkey to evacuate wounded men from the front lines, refused to take his usual route past a particular ravine after May 14th. When asked why, he said the donkey wouldn't go near it, that the animal would balk and refuse to move whenever they approached that section of the track. Animals, Simpson said, knew things that humans had forgotten, and if the donkey sensed danger, he was inclined to trust that instinct over any military map. Simpson was killed by machine gun fire on May 19th, but not in the ravine he had been avoiding. His donkey survived and was eventually evacuated off the peninsula. It never returned to Gallipoli, and years later, its caretakers reported that it would become agitated whenever anyone played music near it, particularly music that involved stringed instruments. On May 16th, Lieutenant William Annier of the 7th Battalion, Australian Imperial Force, led a night patrol into no man's land, with orders to scout Ottoman positions before a planned attack the following morning. The patrol consisted of 8 men, all experienced soldiers who had been on the peninsula since the landing. They moved out at 2100 hours, navigating by moonlight, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. The plan was to reach a ridge 300 meters from the Australian lines, observe enemy positions for 30 minutes, then return. They were last seen at 2145 hours by a forward sentry who watched them disappear into a gully that led toward the ridge. They should have returned by midnight. When they didn't, a search party was organized at first light. The search party found 7 of the 8 men at 0630 hours, sitting in a circle at the bottom of the gully, their weapons laid neatly on the ground in front of them, their backs against the slope as if they were resting. All 7 were dead. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene, but their bodies were rigid with rigor mortis that should not have developed so quickly. The 8th man, Private Colin Watt, was found 2 days later wandering in the Australian trenches, unable to speak, unable to respond to questions. The medical officer who examined him found that his vocal cords had been damaged not by trauma, but by what appeared to be extreme overuse, as if he had been screaming for hours. His hands were covered in small cuts, and his fingernails were torn, as if he had been clawing at something. He had salt crystals in his hair and on his uniform, but he had not been in the water. When shown a photograph of the gully where his patrol had been found, Watt began to convulse, his eyes rolling back, his entire body going rigid. He was evacuated to Egypt and never returned to combat. He died in 1923, never having spoken another word. The official explanation for the patrol's death was carbon monoxide poisoning from a shell that had been gas-filled, but there were problems with this explanation. No gas shells had been fired in that sector. The men showed none of the typical signs of gas exposure, and the circular arrangement of the bodies, the placement of the weapons, suggested that they had sat down deliberately, that they had chosen to stop moving and had done so with a calmness that made no sense in a combat environment. Unofficially, the soldiers who had been in the search party told a different story. They said that when they found the bodies, the air in the gully had been intensely cold, cold enough that frost was visible on the rocks, despite the warm morning sun. They said the singing had been audible, coming from deeper in the gully, from a direction that led toward the sea, even though the sea was not visible from that location. And they said that carved into the rock face above the bodies was a symbol they didn't recognize, a pattern of circles and lines that looked ancient, that looked like it had been there for centuries, even though the rock face had been smooth in aerial reconnaissance photos taken 2 weeks earlier. A Greek civilian who was brought to the site to translate any Ottoman inscriptions took one look at the symbol and refused to go any closer. He said it was a mark of the Sirens, a warning that the area was under their protection and that anyone who entered without permission would not leave alive. He said the symbol appeared in ancient texts, that it had been used by Greek sailors to mark reefs and coastal caves where the Sirens dwelled, and that the presence of such a mark meant that the patrol had stumbled into sacred territory. The British officers dismissed his interpretation as superstition, but they also ordered the gully placed off limits to all patrols. The official reason was suspected enemy presence, but the soldiers knew better. They marked the entrance to the gully with stones stacked in a cairn, and they spread the word, "Stay away from that place. Whatever is in there does not want us." On May 19th, the music changed again. It had been a nightly occurrence, rising from the water after sunset, continuing until dawn, but on that night it came during the day as well. It was heard across the entire peninsula, from Cape Helles to Anzac to Suvla Bay, a melody that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the chest, making hearts skip beats and lungs struggle to draw breath. Men who were in the middle of tasks stopped what they were doing, standing motionless, listening, unable to look away from the water, even when officers shouted orders at them. The Ottoman artillery, which had been firing regular harassment barrages, fell silent. The Ottoman snipers stopped shooting, and for 6 hours, from noon until sunset, both armies simply stopped, paralyzed by music that came from no visible source and carried a message that no one could articulate, but everyone understood. This is not your land. This is not your sea. You are here by sufferance, and that sufferance is running out. At 1800 hours, as the sun touched the horizon, the music stopped. Within minutes, both sides resumed fighting as if nothing had happened. But in the Allied headquarters, in the quiet conversations between officers who were beginning to doubt the wisdom of the campaign, a consensus was forming. Something on Gallipoli was protecting itself, and it was using methods that no military doctrine could address. Major General William Birdwood, commanding the Anzac Corps, sent a cable to General Hamilton that evening. The cable has never been declassified in its entirety, but portions of it were leaked decades later and appeared in the memoirs of a staff officer who had seen it. The relevant section read, "Request permission to conduct formal consultation with local religious authorities regarding operational protocols in theater." Continued equipment failures and unexplained casualties suggest environmental factors not adequately addressed in planning. Recommend suspension of offensive operations until thorough assessment completed. Hamilton's response came back within hours. Request denied. Offensive operations will continue as scheduled. All reports of non-standard phenomena to be routed through medical channels for evaluation of psychological factors. The offensive was scheduled for May 24th. It would be the largest coordinated attack since the initial landing, involving simultaneous assaults at Anzac, Helles, and a new landing at Suvla Bay. 30,000 men would go over the top at dawn, supported by naval gunfire and artillery barrages designed to suppress Ottoman positions. The goal was to break through the Ottoman lines and capture the high ground that had eluded the Allies for nearly a month. But in the trenches, the soldiers who would carry out the attack were hearing the music grow louder every night, were watching their weapons fail with increasing frequency, were finding their comrades dead in positions where no enemy could have reached them. They were beginning to understand that the greatest threat on Gallipoli was not the Turks in the trenches across no man's land, but something far older, something that lived in the water and the earth, something that had been disturbed by the violence and was now demanding its due. On the night of May 23rd, the eve of the Great Offensive, the music reached a crescendo. It was so loud that conversation was impossible, so penetrating that men covered their ears and still could not block it out. And with the music came cold, bitter cold that frosted rifle barrels and turned breath to fog, even though the temperature was 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Sergeant Wiremu Tewera, the Maori soldier who had performed the first ritual acknowledgement, approached Lieutenant Colonel Malone one final time. He said the spirits were warning them that the attack the next morning would fail not because of Ottoman resistance, but because the weapons would not fire, because the earth itself would reject the violence. He said there was still time to make offerings, to acknowledge the manna of the place, but it would require the officers to participate, would require official recognition that the spirits existed and had power. Malone listened, thanked him, and said he would convey the message to higher command. But they both knew nothing would change. The British Empire did not negotiate with spirits. The attack would go forward as planned. And in the water, something ancient and patient waited for the dawn. The offensive began at 0430 hours on May 24th, 30 minutes before dawn. The preparatory barrage had been firing since 0400, shells arcing overhead and impacting Ottoman positions with systematic precision, walking up the slopes in a rolling curtain of high explosive meant to shatter wire and collapse trenches. The naval guns added their voices to the chorus, heavier shells fired from battleships offshore, their trajectories visible as dark streaks against the lightning sky. For 30 minutes, the peninsula shook with the most concentrated bombardment the Allies had yet unleashed. At 0430, the whistles blew. Officers went over the top first, pistols drawn, walking sticks in hand in the old tradition that said leaders led from the front. Behind them came the assault waves, men climbing ladders propped against the forward trench walls, emerging into no man's land, with rifles at the ready, bayonets fixed, moving in lines that stretched across hundreds of meters of front. They advanced at a steady walk, maintaining formation, closing the distance to the Ottoman trenches while the barrage lifted and shifted to targets further inland. And then the weapons stopped working, not all at once, not in a single moment, but in a cascade that rippled through the assault force like a wave. Rifles that had been firing moments before jammed. Machine guns that were supposed to provide covering fire seized up, their bolts frozen in place despite frantic efforts by the crews. Artillery pieces that should have been firing creeping barrages to keep the Ottoman defenders suppressed simply clicked when the lanyards were pulled, the firing pins striking defective primers or striking nothing at all. The soldiers kept advancing because that was what they had been trained to do, because stopping in no man's land meant death, because the momentum of the attack carried them forward even as their weapons became useless weight in their hands. They reached the Ottoman wire, which had not been cut as thoroughly as the planners had promised, and they struggled through it, tearing uniforms and flesh on the barbs, while Ottoman machine guns that had no trouble whatsoever firing poured rounds into them from positions that should have been destroyed by the bombardment. At Anzac, the Australian 2nd Brigade attacked toward a position known as Lone Pine, advancing across 400 meters of open ground under fire from 3 sides. Of the first wave of 800 men, fewer than 200 reached the Ottoman trenches. Those who did found their rifles would not fire, their grenades would not detonate, and they were forced to fight with bayonets and entrenching tools in hand-to-hand combat that turned the trenches into abattoirs. They gained a foothold, but could not expand it, could not bring up reinforcements because the supporting waves were pinned down by fire from positions that should have been suppressed but were fully operational. The temperature across the battlefield began to drop. At first it was subtle, a few degrees that might have been attributed to dawn's coolness, but within 20 minutes it had fallen from 75 degrees to 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was still dropping. Men who had been sweating from exertion now saw their breath fog. Frost formed on metal surfaces, on rifle barrels, on ammunition pouches, on the wire that trapped wounded men between the lines. The sky was clear, the sun rising, but the cold was absolute, emanating from the water, from the ravines that led to the sea, from the earth itself. And the music began. It rose over the sound of gunfire, over the screams of wounded men, over the shouts of officers trying to maintain order. It was not the distant melody that had characterized the previous nights, but something immediate, something that felt like it was coming from inside the soldiers' own heads. Some men dropped their weapons and covered their ears. Others stood motionless, staring toward the water, tears streaming down their faces for reasons they could not articulate. A few began walking toward the sea, away from the battle, moving with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers, deaf to the commands of their officers. At Helles, the Royal Naval Division attacked toward the village of Krithia, a position that had been an objective since the first day of the landing and had never been taken. They advanced in waves, each wave melting under Ottoman fire, each wave adding to the bodies that already carpeted the approaches. But it was not just Ottoman fire that stopped them. It was the rifles that would not fire, the grenades that would not explode, and the machine guns that jammed after 3 or 4 rounds. The divisional armorer, a warrant officer named James Sutherland, moved between positions trying to clear jams and found that the weapons were not mechanically defective. They simply refused to function, as if the metal itself had become hostile to the purpose it was designed to serve. Sutherland was a practical man who had maintained weapons for 20 years in the Royal Navy. He did not believe in magic or curses, but as he worked on a Vickers machine gun that had fired perfectly during testing that morning and now would not chamber a single round, he felt something that made the hair on his arms stand up. The metal was cold, far colder than it should have been, and when he touched the receiver, he heard something. Not with his ears, but with something deeper, something primal. Singing. A woman's voice speaking words he did not know but understood on some level below consciousness. You do not belong here. You are not invited. Leave our waters or join the drowned. He stepped back from the weapon, his hands shaking, and told the gun crew that the weapon was beyond field repair. The crew didn't argue. They had heard it too. They abandoned the position and fell back to the secondary trench line, leaving the machine gun sitting on its tripod, pointed toward an enemy it would never fire at again. By 0630 hours, 2 hours into the offensive, it was clear that the attack had failed. The Allies had gained minimal ground at catastrophic cost. Casualty reports were still being compiled, but preliminary estimates suggested over 5,000 killed or wounded in the first waves alone. The Ottoman defenders had taken casualties too, but nothing approaching the Allied losses, and their positions remained intact, their weapons functional, their morale unshaken. General Hamilton, observing from the deck of HMS Queen Elizabeth offshore, demanded to know why the assault had stalled. The reports that came back were confused, contradictory, and in some cases incomprehensible. Officers reported weapon failures on a scale that defied explanation. They reported soldiers refusing to advance, not from cowardice, but from what appeared to be genuine physical inability to move forward. They reported temperature drops that had no meteorological basis, and music that seemed to be coming from the water itself, music so loud that verbal commands were inaudible. Hamilton dismissed most of these reports as the confusion of battle, as the inevitable chaos that occurred when plans met reality. He ordered the assault to continue, ordered fresh reserves committed to the attack, ordered the naval bombardment intensified. But the reserves, when they went forward, encountered the same phenomena. Their weapons failed. The cold intensified, and the music grew so loud that some men began to vomit from the sensory overload, their equilibrium disrupted by sound that operated on frequencies the human body was not designed to process. At 1100 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Malone, commanding the Wellington Battalion at Anzac, sent a message directly to division headquarters that bypassed the normal chain of command. The message was brief and direct. Request immediate cessation of offensive operations. Weapons non-functional. Men experiencing environmental distress of unknown origin. Continuing assault will result in total casualties with no tactical gain. Respectfully suggest consultation with local civilian authorities regarding site-specific hazards before resuming operations. The message was received, logged, and ignored, but a copy of it, made by a signals officer who thought it might be important, survived in private papers and surfaced decades later. It became one of the few documentary pieces of evidence that suggested official awareness of what was happening on Gallipoli. By noon, the offensive had completely collapsed. The few positions that had been taken were abandoned under counterattack. The wounded were being evacuated in numbers that overwhelmed the medical services. And across the entire Allied front, soldiers were reporting the same thing. The weapons would not work, the cold was unbearable, and the singing was driving them mad. In the water off Anzac Cove, sailors on the destroyers that were ferrying wounded to hospital ships reported seeing shapes moving beneath the surface. Not submarines, not schools of fish, but something else. Humanoid forms, dozens of them, swimming parallel to the ships, keeping pace effortlessly, even though the destroyers were making 15 knots. The shapes never surfaced, never came close enough to be clearly identified, but their presence was consistent, verified by multiple observers who had no reason to lie and no history of unreliability. One sailor, a lookout named Henry Collins, later testified during an inquiry into the loss of HMS Majestic that he had seen one of the shapes breach the surface briefly on the afternoon of May 24th. He described it as female in appearance, with long hair that moved independently of the water, with eyes that reflected light like a cat's eyes, and with hands that had webbing between the fingers. He said it looked directly at him, held his gaze for perhaps 3 seconds, and then dove beneath the waves. He said he had felt in that moment that it was not hostile, not exactly, but that it was warning him. warning all of them that they were being tolerated, but that tolerance had limits. The inquiry dismissed his testimony as a hallucination brought on by fatigue and stress. But Collins was not alone. 17 other sailors on various ships reported similar sightings over the next week, and while their descriptions varied in detail, they all agreed on the essentials. Something was in the water, something that watched them, something that was neither fish nor human, but something in between. On the night of May 24th, after the failed offensive, the Allied positions fell silent except for the groans of the wounded and the occasional crack of a sniper rifle. The men who had survived the day huddled in their trenches, cleaning weapons that refused to work, trying to understand what had happened. The music came again, as it did every night, but this time it was different. This time it sounded triumphant, celebratory, as if whatever lived in the water was pleased with the day's outcome. Sergeant Tewera, the Maori soldier who had tried to warn them, approached the water's edge one final time. He spoke words in Te Reo Maori, words of acknowledgement and respect, and he placed in the water the only thing of value he still possessed, a greenstone pendant that had belonged to his grandfather, a taonga that carried his family's mana. He said he was sorry, that his people had not intended disrespect, that they were here because they had been ordered to be here, not because they wished to violate the sacred places. The music stopped. Not completely, but it softened, became something closer to what it had been in the early days of the landing. Tewera stood at the water's edge for several minutes, waiting, and then he returned to his dugout. He said nothing to anyone about what he had done, but the Wellington Battalion, his unit, experienced no further weapon failures for the remainder of their time on Gallipoli. The other units were not so fortunate. The week following the failed offensive was characterized by a phenomenon that military historians would later struggle to explain. Across the entire Gallipoli front, combat intensity dropped to levels not seen since the initial landing. The Ottoman forces did not press their advantage. The Allied forces did not attempt further assaults. Both armies seemed to have reached an unspoken agreement to simply endure, to hold their positions without the aggressive patrolling and raiding that had marked the previous month. But it was not exhaustion or tactical reassessment that created this lull. It was fear. On the night of May 27, the phenomenon that the soldiers had been calling the Siren songs reached its apex. The music that had been a nightly occurrence became constant, audible during the day, as well as the night, rising from every ravine that led to the sea, from every section of beach, from the water itself. It was no longer melodic in any recognizable sense, but had become something more fundamental, more visceral, a vibration that could be felt in the chest, that made the heart skip beats, that caused nausea and disorientation in men who had survived months of combat without flinching. The cold zones expanded. Areas that had been merely uncomfortable became uninhabitable. Sections of trench had to be abandoned because the temperature inside them dropped below freezing, despite the external temperature hovering near 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Men who spent more than 15 minutes in these zones developed symptoms of hypothermia, shivering, confusion, loss of motor control. 3 soldiers died of exposure while sitting in trenches where they should have been perfectly safe, their bodies found frozen solid in positions that suggested they had simply stopped moving and let the cold take them. The weapon failures became universal. Not a single rifle, machine gun, or artillery piece in the Allied inventory functioned reliably. Some weapons would fire 1 round, then jam. Others would not fire at all. Ammunition that had tested perfectly in the supply depots misfired or failed to detonate when loaded into weapons. Grenades became inert. Even bayonets, the most primitive weapons available, seemed reluctant to penetrate flesh, bending or breaking when they should have held firm. The Royal Navy experienced similar failures. On May 28th, HMS Goliath, a pre-dreadnought battleship providing fire support for the Allied positions, suffered a catastrophic magazine explosion that killed over 500 sailors and sank the ship in less than 3 minutes. The official explanation was torpedo attack by an Ottoman submarine, but survivors reported that the explosion occurred spontaneously, that there had been no torpedo wake, no warning, just a sudden detonation that tore the ship apart from within. They reported that in the moments before the explosion, the ship's entire electrical system had failed, and the singing had been audible even over the sound of the engines, so loud that some sailors had abandoned their posts to cover their ears. The survivors who made it to shore told stories that were not included in the official inquiry. They said they had seen shapes in the water as they swam, humanoid forms that circled them like sharks but never attacked, just watched, just observed. They said the water had been impossibly cold, cold enough that most of them should have died from hypothermia before reaching shore, but something had guided them, had pushed them toward the beach, as if whatever lived in the straits wanted witnesses, wanted survivors who could carry the story. At Anzac Cove, the situation had deteriorated to the point where normal military operations were no longer possible. Supplies could not be landed because the boats that attempted to approach the beach either lost power or were driven off course by currents that did not appear on any navigational chart. The few boats that made it to shore found their crews unable or unwilling to unload the cargo, the sailors reporting a feeling of overwhelming dread that intensified the closer they came to the water's edge. On May 29th, General Birdwood made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. He requested a meeting with local Greek civilians who had remained in the area, specifically asking for those who understood the traditional beliefs of the region. The meeting was not official. It was not documented in the operational logs, but it happened in a tent behind the lines with Birdwood, several staff officers, and 3 elderly Greeks who had been employed as laborers and translators. The Greeks explained what they had been trying to explain since the beginning. The Dardanelles was sacred territory. It had been sacred to the pre-Hellenic peoples who lived here before the Greeks, sacred to the Greeks who came after, sacred to the Romans who inherited the region, and sacred to the Turks who controlled it now. The spirits who guarded these waters were older than any human civilization, older than memory, and they demanded respect. They demanded acknowledgement. They demanded offerings and rituals that recognized their sovereignty over this place. The British had not made such offerings. They had come with guns and explosives and the arrogance of empire, treating the land and sea as resources to be exploited, as terrain to be conquered. And the spirits had responded with patience at first, with warnings, with subtle signs that escalated as the violence continued. The weapon failures, the cold, the music, these were not attacks. These were communications. The spirits were saying, in the only language available to them, leave or be absorbed into this place forever. Birdwood asked what needed to be done. The Greeks said it was probably too late, that too much blood had been spilled, too many had died, but if there was to be any hope of placating the spirits, it would require formal acknowledgement from the highest-ranking officer present, a public ritual conducted at the water's edge, and an offering of significant value. Not money or supplies, but something that carried meaning. Weapons, perhaps, the very instruments of violence that had offended the spirits in the first place. Birdwood said he would consider it. He dismissed the Greeks and convened a staff meeting where he presented what he had been told. The response was predictable. Half the officers thought he had lost his mind. The other half were willing to consider anything at this point because conventional military solutions had utterly failed. After 2 hours of debate, a compromise was reached. They would not conduct any formal ritual, which would be seen as capitulation to superstition and would damage morale, but they would implement new protocols that happened to align with what the Greeks had suggested. Orders went out on May 30th. All units were to cease offensive operations indefinitely. Ammunition dumps were to be relocated away from the water. No soldiers were to approach the shoreline except when absolutely necessary for loading or unloading supplies. Bodies that had been left unburied were to be recovered and properly interred with full military honors, regardless of whether they were Allied or Ottoman. And a ceasefire was to be negotiated with the Ottoman command for the specific purpose of allowing both sides to bury their dead. The ceasefire request was transmitted through neutral channels and was accepted by the Ottomans within hours, which surprised the British staff but should not have. The Ottomans had been experiencing their own problems, though theirs were less severe. Their weapons functioned, but their soldiers were terrified of the water, refusing to patrol near the coast, reporting visions and voices that their officers could not dismiss because too many men reported the same things. The Ottoman command was Muslim, but the Ottoman soldiers included Greeks, Armenians, and Arabs who understood the old beliefs, and their officers were practical enough to recognize that something beyond tactics was at work. The ceasefire began at noon on May 31st. Both sides emerged from their trenches tentatively, weapons lowered, moving into no man's land to collect the bodies that had been rotting there since the offensive a week earlier. It was the first time soldiers from both sides had been in the same space without shooting at each other, and the atmosphere was surreal. British and Australian soldiers worked alongside Ottoman soldiers, identifying bodies, loading them onto stretchers, treating the dead with a respect that had been absent during the fighting. And as they worked, the music changed. It became softer, more melancholic, losing the aggressive edge that had characterized it for weeks. The temperature began to rise, the unnatural cold dissipating as the day progressed. And the soldiers, on both sides, felt something they had not felt since arriving on the peninsula, a sense of release, as if a pressure that had been building for weeks was finally easing. The burials were conducted that evening, mass graves dug into the hillsides above the beaches, chaplains and imams performing the rites appropriate to each faith. The soldiers stood in ranks, helmets removed, heads bowed, while the dead were committed to the earth with prayers in English, Turkish, Arabic, and Maori. When the last body was buried and the last prayer spoken, the music stopped completely for the first time in over a month. The silence was profound. Men who had not slept properly in weeks suddenly felt exhaustion crash over them. They returned to their trenches and slept for 10, 12, 14 hours, dreamless sleep that left them restored in ways they could not articulate. And when they woke, they found that their weapons worked again. Not perfectly. There were still occasional misfires and jams, but reliably enough to function as weapons were supposed to function. But the relief was temporary. On June 2nd, 2 days after the ceasefire and burial ceremony, the music returned. Not as loud as before, not as aggressive, but present, a reminder that the spirits had not left, that they were watching, that the accommodation reached was conditional, dependent on behavior that acknowledged their presence. General Hamilton, informed of the informal agreement Birdwood had reached with the local civilians, was furious. He sent a strongly worded cable demanding an explanation for why military operations had been suspended without authorization, why a ceasefire had been negotiated without consulting headquarters, and why his subordinate commanders seemed to believe that appeasing local superstitions was an appropriate use of military resources. Birdwood's response was brief and pointed. Respectfully submit that conventional military solutions have proven ineffective. Casualty rate unsustainable. Alternative approaches warranted. Request permission to continue present course of action pending improvement in operational conditions. Hamilton denied the request. He ordered offensive operations to resume within 48 hours, ordered increased bombardment of Ottoman positions, and ordered a formal investigation into the conduct of officers who had participated in what he termed unauthorized negotiations with civilian elements. The investigation never occurred because on June 4th, before Hamilton's orders could be implemented, something happened that changed everything. The Ottoman batteries on the high ground, which had been relatively quiet during the ceasefire, opened fire with an intensity not seen since the initial landing. But they were not firing at Allied positions. They were firing at the water, at specific points along the coast, at targets that no one could see, but which the Ottoman gunners seemed convinced were there. The barrage lasted 3 hours. Thousands of shells poured into the sea at ranges so close that some of them fell among the Ottoman forward trenches. When the barrage finally stopped, the Ottoman soldiers began to evacuate their positions. Not in retreat, not under attack, but in coordinated withdrawal that suggested orders from high command. Within 24 hours, the Ottoman defenses on the southern portion of the peninsula had been pulled back 2 kilometers inland, abandoning positions they had held since the beginning of the campaign. Allied reconnaissance patrols moved into the abandoned trenches cautiously, expecting booby traps or ambushes. They found neither. What they found was evidence that the Ottomans had left in extreme haste. Equipment abandoned, supplies left behind, and messages scrawled on the walls of dugouts in Turkish and Arabic. One message, translated by an intelligence officer, read simply, "The Jinn have awakened. We will not fight them. Let the British have this cursed ground." The spirits had chosen, and they had chosen to make Gallipoli uninhabitable for everyone. The evacuation of Gallipoli began on December 19, 1915, 7 months after the Ottoman withdrawal from the southern positions. In those 7 months, the campaign had devolved from military operation to survival ordeal. No major offensives were attempted. Both sides simply held their positions, enduring the heat of summer and the storms of early winter, losing men to disease and sniper fire and the random cruelty of artillery barrages, while the spirits in the water sang every night, and the weapons functioned just poorly enough to make offensive action impossible. The evacuation was the most successful operation of the entire campaign. Over 80,000 men were removed from the peninsula in 2 weeks with fewer than a dozen casualties, a logistical achievement that would be studied in military academies for decades. But the official histories would not mention that the evacuation proceeded smoothly because the spirits allowed it to proceed, because the music that had tormented the soldiers for months became almost gentle during the final days, as if whatever lived in the water was satisfied that the invaders were finally leaving. The last British soldier departed from Cape Helles on January 9, 1916. The last Australian left from Anzac Cove on December 20th, 1915. They took with them their wounded, their salvageable equipment, and their memories, but they left behind something that could never be recovered: the dead. Over 50,000 Allied soldiers were killed at Gallipoli, and while some were buried in marked graves, many were not. They remained in the earth and the water, absorbed into the place they had tried to conquer, claimed by the spirits they had offended. The survivors carried Gallipoli with them for the rest of their lives. Not just the trauma of combat, which was common to all soldiers of the Great War, but something else, something that resisted explanation. Veterans of the campaign reported recurring dreams of drowning even when they died far from water. They reported hearing music in moments of silence, melodies that sounded like the songs from the beaches. They reported feeling watched when they were near the sea, feeling a presence that was neither malevolent nor benign, but simply aware. Lieutenant Colonel William Malone did not survive to see the evacuation. He was killed on August 8th during the Battle of Chunuk Bair, struck by artillery fire from a British naval gun that had been firing in support of New Zealand positions, but had somehow missed its target coordinates by over a kilometer. His body was buried on the hillside where he fell, and his grave became one of the few that were properly marked and maintained. His diary, recovered and sent to his family, ended with an entry from August 7th that read, "The spirits have not forgiven us for our arrogance. I fear we will pay for it long after this campaign ends." Sergeant Wiramutewera survived. He returned to New Zealand in 1916, was discharged from service, and lived until 1954. He never spoke publicly about what happened at Gallipoli, but he became a respected kaumatua, a Maori elder, and he taught his people the importance of acknowledging the mana of places where death had occurred. In 1950, he was interviewed by a researcher collecting oral histories of Maori service in the Great War, and in that interview, he said something that was not included in the official transcript but was preserved in the researcher's personal notes. The Pakeha think the war ended when they left Gallipoli. But the war never ended. The spirits are still there. They are always there. And they are waiting for the next time someone forgets to show respect. The weapon failures that characterized Gallipoli did not occur in other theaters of the Great War to the same extent. There were malfunctions, certainly, the inevitable mechanical failures that plague all military equipment, but nothing approaching the systematic breakdowns that plagued the Dardanelles campaign. Military investigators examined weapons that had been evacuated from Gallipoli and found them to be in serviceable condition, showing no unusual wear or damage. When those same weapons were issued to units fighting in France or Mesopotamia, they performed normally. The implication was clear, though it was never stated officially. The problem had not been with the weapons. It had been with the place. In 1919, the Imperial War Graves Commission began the work of cataloging and memorializing the dead from Gallipoli. They established cemeteries at Cape Helles, at Anzac Cove, at Suvla Bay, each one containing thousands of graves marked with simple white headstones. But the commission's workers reported difficulties. Equipment malfunctioned frequently, vehicles broke down, tools vanished, and the workers themselves experienced phenomena they could not explain. Cold spots in the cemeteries, even during summer heat, sounds of singing that came from no visible source, and the sensation of being watched by something that remained just out of sight. One worker, a British veteran named Arthur Price, who had volunteered for the commission after surviving the Western Front, wrote in a letter to his wife, "I have been in many places where men died, but Gallipoli is different. It does not feel like the dead are at rest here. It feels like they are waiting. The locals say we should not be here after dark, and I am inclined to agree with them. Something about this place makes my skin crawl, even in broad daylight." The Turkish government, which took control of the peninsula after the war, had its own experiences. Attempts to resettle the area were unsuccessful. Villages that had been abandoned during the fighting remained abandoned. Fishermen avoided certain sections of the coast, claiming that nets cast there came up empty or tangled in ways that suggested deliberate interference. And Turkish soldiers stationed at the memorials and historical sites reported the same phenomena the Allied forces had experienced: weapon malfunctions, auditory phenomena, and a pervasive sense of unease that made extended deployments difficult. In 1934, the Turkish government invited Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, and the Ottoman commander who had led the defense of Gallipoli, to speak at a commemoration ceremony. Ataturk, who was by then a secular modernizer with no patience for religious or supernatural beliefs, agreed. But on the night before the ceremony, he experienced something that shook him. He was staying in a house near the cemetery at Anzac Cove when he was awakened by music so loud it seemed impossible that others in the house had not heard it. He went to the window and saw standing in the cemetery figures that appeared to be soldiers in old-style uniforms, neither Ottoman nor British, but something older, moving among the graves with purpose. He never spoke publicly about what he saw that night, but he left the house before dawn and delivered his speech from a location several kilometers away, rather than at the cemetery, as originally planned. And in his private correspondence, preserved in Turkish state archives, there is a letter to a confidant in which he wrote, "I have spent my life fighting against superstition and backward thinking. But there are places in this world where the old beliefs have power, and Gallipoli is one of them. We won the battle, but we did not win the land. Something else holds sovereignty there, and it is not us." The most comprehensive study of the Gallipoli anomalies was conducted in 1967 by a retired British brigadier named Sir Geoffrey Thompson, who had served as a junior officer during the campaign and had spent 50 years trying to understand what he had experienced. He collected testimony from over 300 veterans, cross-referenced it with official records and weather data, and produced a manuscript titled Non-Standard Combat Phenomena, an analysis of the Dardanelles Campaign, 1915 to 1916. The manuscript was never published. Thompson submitted it to the British Ministry of Defense with a request that it be included in the official military history series. The ministry declined, stating that the manuscript contained unsubstantiated claims and speculation not supported by documentary evidence. Thompson appealed, arguing that the testimony of 300 veterans constituted evidence that the weapon failure rates documented in official records were statistically impossible to explain through conventional means, and that ignoring the data did not make it disappear. His appeal was denied. The manuscript was classified and deposited in the National Archives with a closure period of 75 years, not to be opened until 2042. But Thompson had made copies, and one of those copies found its way to an Australian military historian in the 1980s, who read it and recognized that Thompson had documented something important, something that challenged conventional understanding of what had occurred at Gallipoli. The manuscript described patterns that Thompson had identified through his analysis, weapon failures clustered in specific geographic locations that corresponded to sites identified by local Greeks as sacred or spiritually significant. Casualties from exposure to cold were concentrated in areas near water sources or in ravines that led to the sea. And reports of auditory phenomena followed a temporal pattern that aligned with ancient Greek and Turkish maritime rituals, occurring most frequently during new moon periods when, according to local tradition, the sirens were most active. Thompson's conclusion was carefully worded but unambiguous. The evidence suggests that factors beyond conventional military analysis influenced the outcome of the Gallipoli campaign. Whether these factors are properly understood as environmental, psychological, or as belonging to a category not adequately addressed by Western scientific frameworks, they were real, they were documented, and they had material effect on military operations. Future operations in culturally significant areas should include consultation with local religious and cultural authorities as part of operational planning. No such consultations were ever mandated in British or Allied military doctrine. Thompson's recommendations were filed away with his manuscript, and the official history of Gallipoli remained a story of tactical errors, logistical failures, and Ottoman military prowess, with no mention of spirits or sirens or weapons that refused to fire. But the veterans knew, and they passed the knowledge to their children and grandchildren, not as history, but as warning. There are places in the world where the rules are different, where the old powers still hold sway, and Gallipoli is one of them. If you go there, show respect, make acknowledgement, and do not assume that because you carry a gun and wear a uniform, you are in control. In modern times, Gallipoli has become a pilgrimage site, particularly for Australians and New Zealanders observing Anzac Day. Thousands visit the beaches and cemeteries each April, paying respects to the fallen. Most experience nothing unusual, but some report sensations they cannot explain. Sudden cold in warm weather, music that seems to come from the water, and the feeling of being watched by something ancient and patient. The Turkish authorities who manage the sites know these reports. They do not publicize them, do not acknowledge them in official materials, but they quietly maintain protocols that align with what the spirits seem to require. The cemeteries are well maintained, the graves are treated with respect, and no commercial or industrial development is permitted in the areas identified as most sensitive. These are not superstitious precautions. They are practical responses to observed patterns of equipment failure, accidents, and worker attrition that occur when the protocols are not followed. The weapons that failed at Gallipoli are gone now, scrapped or lost, or rusting in forgotten armories. But the place remains. and the spirits remain, and the music continues for those who have ears to hear it. The British War Office file on the Dardanelles campaign occupies 17 linear meters of shelf space in the National Archives at Kew. It contains operational orders, casualty reports, after-action summaries, intelligence assessments, and correspondence between commanders spanning the 8-month duration of the campaign. It is one of the most thoroughly documented military operations in British history, analyzed by generations of military historians seeking to understand how such a promising strategic concept devolved into catastrophic failure. But there is a subsection of the file designated WO 158/947 that few researchers ever request. It is not restricted, not classified, but it is not indexed in the main catalog either, and its existence is known primarily through word of mouth among specialists. The subsection contains what the archivists euphemistically call anomalous incident reports, documents that do not fit comfortably into the conventional narrative of the campaign, documents that describe events which the authors themselves struggled to categorize. Within WO 158/947 are 23 separate reports, filed by officers ranging from lieutenants to brigadiers, describing weapon failures that occurred in patterns inconsistent with mechanical defect or ammunition quality. There are 14 reports of mass hypothermia incidents occurring in conditions where meteorological data shows ambient temperatures above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. There are 41 reports of auditory phenomena, each one describing music or singing coming from unidentified sources, with multiple witnesses corroborating the accounts. And there is one report filed by a Royal Navy chaplain describing a religious ceremony conducted at the request of enlisted sailors who believed their ship was cursed and would not function properly until the curse was acknowledged and addressed. These reports were filed through normal channels, compiled by staff officers at various headquarters, and forwarded to the War Office in London, where they were received, logged, and quietly set aside. No investigations were conducted. No follow-up inquiries were made. The reports were simply accumulated in a file that grew throughout 1915 and 1916, and then, after the evacuation, the file was closed and archived with a notation that read, "Miscellaneous reports not suitable for inclusion in official history. Retained for potential medical/psychological research purposes." No such research was ever conducted. The file sat untouched until 1967, when Sir Geoffrey Thompson requested access while compiling his manuscript. He was the first person to recognize that the reports, taken together, described a coherent pattern. He copied portions of them into his own work, and when his manuscript was classified, the anomalous incident reports were retroactively classified as well, not because they contained military secrets, but because they corroborated Thompson's conclusions in ways that the Ministry of Defense found uncomfortable. The classification lasted until 1990, when a scheduled review determined that nothing in the reports posed a threat to national security. The file was declassified and returned to its original status, public but obscure, available but rarely accessed. A handful of researchers have examined it since then, and most have concluded that the reports document the psychological effects of prolonged combat stress. A few have suggested that environmental factors, extreme heat, dehydration, endemic disease, created conditions conducive to mass hallucination. None have seriously entertained the possibility that the reports describe actual phenomena that fall outside the boundaries of conventional scientific explanation. But the pattern documented in WO 158/947 is not unique to Gallipoli. Similar files exist in the military archives of other nations describing similar phenomena in other conflicts. The Australian War Memorial holds a collection of personal diaries and letters from Gallipoli veterans that were donated by families decades after the war. Among these papers are accounts that were never intended for official consumption, accounts written by men trying to process what they had experienced and finding no framework adequate to contain it. One such account, written by Corporal James Mackenzie of the 4th Australian Infantry Battalion, describes an incident from June 1915 in which his entire section experienced simultaneous weapon failure during a trench raid. Mackenzie writes, "Our rifles simply would not work. The bolts would not close, the triggers would not pull, as if the metal itself had decided it would no longer participate in the killing. And in that moment, we heard singing, beautiful and terrible, and we understood that we were not alone in that trench, that something was there with us, something that did not want the fighting to continue." Mackenzie survived Gallipoli, returned to Australia, and lived until 1964. He never spoke publicly about what he experienced, but his diary was preserved by his daughter and eventually donated to the War Memorial in 1998. It is one of hundreds of similar documents held in archives around the world, each one a fragment of a larger story that official histories have chosen not to tell. The Ottoman archives contain their own records. The Turkish General Staff Historical Archives in Ankara hold files from the Gallipoli campaign that include reports from Ottoman commanders describing difficulties with troop morale in certain sectors, specifically sectors near the coast, where soldiers reported seeing apparitions and hearing voices from the water. One report, dated July 1915, describes a mutiny among Arab auxiliary troops who refused to occupy trenches near Cape Helles, stating that the jinn had claimed the area and that any Muslim who fought there would be cursed. The Ottoman response to these reports was different from the British response. Ottoman commanders, operating within a cultural framework that acknowledged the existence of spiritual forces, did not dismiss the reports as hallucination or psychological breakdown. Instead, they consulted with religious authorities, with imams, and with local Greeks who understood the pre-Islamic traditions of the region. The result was a series of accommodations. Certain areas were avoided when possible, religious ceremonies were conducted before occupying new positions, and offerings were made at shrines and sacred sites to acknowledge the spiritual sovereignty of the place. These accommodations were never formalized in military doctrine, but they were transmitted through informal channels, through the advice of experienced officers to newly arrived units. And they worked in the sense that Ottoman forces experienced fewer of the anomalous incidents that plagued the Allies. Their weapons functioned, their morale remained stable, and they won the campaign. After the war, as the Ottoman Empire collapsed and was replaced by the Turkish Republic, the old beliefs were officially discouraged. Ataturk's modernization program sought to eliminate superstition and replace it with secular rationalism. But the traditions persisted in rural areas, particularly along the coasts, where the connection to pre-Islamic beliefs remained strong. Fishermen continued to make offerings before sailing into certain waters. Farmers avoided building on land that had been battlefields, and the stories continued to be told, passed from generation to generation. The Sirens are real, they guard the straits, and they do not forgive disrespect. In 1987, an international team of marine archaeologists conducted a survey of the Dardanelles, mapping shipwrecks and underwater archaeological sites. The team included researchers from Turkey, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, and they spent 3 months surveying the seafloor using sonar and remote-operated vehicles. Their work produced detailed maps of dozens of wrecks from various historical periods, including several from the 1915 campaign. But the team also documented anomalies that they could not explain. In certain areas, their electronic equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, losing power or producing corrupt data with no identifiable technical cause. In other areas, the water temperature measurements were inconsistent with seasonal norms, showing cold zones that persisted even when surrounding waters were significantly warmer. And on 3 separate occasions, cameras on the remote vehicles captured images of what appeared to be humanoid figures moving through the water at depths and speeds that should not have been possible for human divers. The images were inconclusive, degraded by water conditions and the limitations of the equipment, but they were suggestive enough that the team's lead archaeologist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the University of Sydney, included them in her preliminary report with a notation: recommend further investigation of biological phenomena observed in survey area, possible undocumented marine species, or unusual optical effects requiring specialist analysis. The follow-up investigation never occurred, funding was not approved, and Dr. Mitchell's request to return to the site was denied without explanation. She later stated in an interview that she believed there were institutional reasons for the denial, that certain parties did not want thorough documentation of phenomena that might complicate the historical narrative of Gallipoli. She retired in 2003, and her research materials were deposited in the University of Sydney archives, where they remain available to researchers who know to look for them. The most explicit connection between the Gallipoli phenomena and broader patterns of anomalous military incidents appears in a classified NATO study from 2009 titled Cultural Considerations in Expeditionary Operations. The study was commissioned by the NATO Strategic Plans and Policy Division and conducted by a team of anthropologists, military historians, and operational planners. Its purpose was to develop guidelines for operating in culturally complex environments where local beliefs and traditions might affect military effectiveness. The study included a chapter on spiritually contested terrain, which examined historical cases where military operations had encountered resistance that could not be fully explained through conventional analysis. Gallipoli was one of 3 primary case studies, alongside the French experience at Dien Bien Phu and the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. The chapter noted that in all 3 cases, unusual patterns of equipment failure had been reported, that local populations had warned of spiritual hazards that were ignored by military planners, and that operations in these areas had ultimately failed or succeeded only after accommodations were made to local spiritual protocols. The study's recommendations were carefully worded to avoid explicitly endorsing supernatural explanations, but they were clear in practical terms. When operating in areas with strong indigenous spiritual traditions, particularly areas associated with historical violence or sacred sites, commanders should consult with local religious and cultural authorities during the planning process. Failure to acknowledge local beliefs, regardless of their objective validity, creates unnecessary friction and may result in morale problems, equipment difficulties, and operational complications that undermine mission effectiveness. The recommendations were incorporated into NATO doctrine as cultural sensitivity guidelines, stripped of any reference to spiritual or supernatural factors, and framed entirely in terms of community relations and psychological operations. But the officers who implemented the guidelines understood the subtext. They understood that in certain places, under certain conditions, the rules changed, and ignoring that reality had consequences. The legacy of Gallipoli is carried forward in the oral traditions of military units that served there. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps maintains institutional memory through ceremonial observances and historical education, and within that education are stories that are never written down, but are told to new generations of soldiers, stories about the singing from the water, stories about weapons that refuse to work, stories about the need to show respect, to acknowledge that some places belong to forces older than nations, and that those forces remain present even when we choose not to see them. In 2015, on the centenary of the Gallipoli landings, a massive international commemoration was held on the peninsula. Over 10,000 people attended, including heads of state from Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. The ceremony was conducted with full military honors, with readings and prayers, and the laying of wreaths at the cemeteries where the dead still rest. And on the night before the ceremony, the music returned. It was heard by maintenance crews working to set up the commemorative site, by security personnel patrolling the beaches, and by journalists who had arrived early to establish their positions. Not all of them heard it, But enough did that it became a topic of conversation in the press tent, a story that was considered for publication and then quietly dropped because no one wanted to be seen as promoting superstition or disrespecting the solemnity of the event. But the music was real. It was recorded by several people using mobile phones, and those recordings circulated online, analyzed by acousticians and musicians who noted that the melodies did not match any known musical tradition, that they contained harmonic structures that seemed mathematically impossible, and that listening to them for extended periods produced measurable physiological effects. Changes in heart rate, in breathing patterns, in the electrical activity of the brain. The recordings were eventually removed from most platforms, flagged as copyright violations or community standards breaches, but copies persist in private archives and academic collections. They persist as evidence, as proof that something at Gallipoli transcends historical narrative, as testimony that the sirens are not myth but reality, and that they are still singing, still watching, still waiting for the next time someone forgets that the Dardanelles are not just water and stone, but a threshold between worlds, guarded by powers that do not recognize the sovereignty of empires. The official histories will never acknowledge this. The textbooks will continue to explain Gallipoli through tactics and logistics, through the decisions of commanders and the courage of soldiers. And that explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because Gallipoli was also a confrontation between the modern world and something older, between the belief that humans control nature and the reality that in certain places, under certain conditions, nature controls us. The weapons failed at Gallipoli. They failed because they were asked to kill in a place where killing had been forbidden, in waters that had been sacred for millennia, on ground that belonged to spirits who remembered when humans were visitors rather than conquerors. The weapons failed because the sirens willed them to fail, because the boundary between the material and the spiritual was thin there, and because sometimes, despite all our technology and our certainty, we are not in control. And the sirens remain. In the Dardanelles, in the waters where the dead still float, in the spaces between the waves where the old songs are sung. They remain as guardians, as judges, as reminders that there are forces in this world that existed before us and will exist after us, forces that we ignore at our peril. The next time an army approaches those waters, the sirens will be waiting, and their guns will sing again.